Hey everyone, this is Tony Gray from the Opinionated Security Podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about third-party cyber risk assessment programs and how we can turn them on their heads a little bit to think about them differently so that we get actual measurable results that then can be included as part of a security program. First of all, I'm not a vendor. I don't sell anything. I'm a CISO, but I'm probably not your CISO. So, every organization is different. Please don't construe any legal advice or compliance advice from anything that I have to say. I'm just an opinionated guy on the internet and that runs a security program that I think is pretty successful. And also remember that none of my opinions represent the opinions of my employer. Obviously, everybody's seen the news with the very impactful industry-wide recent third-party breaches. I'm not going to cover those breaches in any detail at all. There's plenty of other blog posts and videos where you can go if you need to get that information. What I will talk about, though, is it's not just the big industry-wide ones that you have to concern yourself with. Perhaps there are ransomware attacks or breaches on third-party vendors that you have, partners, contract organizations that you have that could make the news. Maybe they don't make the news, but they're equally risky to your organization in terms of protecting your systems and corporate data. They may also involve having to declare a breach to your regulators, even though the breach did not necessarily occur within your systems. It's important to frame third-party risk assessments in terms of the business process that they represent. It's a business process with an outcome of making better decisions around contractual requirements or organizations that we want to do business with. That's oftentimes forgotten. It's not an activity in which we're just doing assessment after assessment after assessment after assessment, and those assessments just get put into a file or stored someplace in your infrastructure after they're completed. They need to be a living part of the way that your organization does its due diligence and takes the results of that due diligence and brings it back into your security program in some way. As part of that business process, there's two criteria that the business may use in order to informally assess the success of the business process known as third-party risk assessment. They may look at the amount of time that it takes to perform the assessment, and they may also take a look at the fidelity of the results. Now, oftentimes fidelity is juxtaposed against speed. It takes more time to get high fidelity results, and that impacts your speed in order to be able to provide the business decision-making rationale back to the business. Now, your third-party cyber risk assessment program may be different, but the majority of organizations that I'm familiar with, their third-party cyber risk program consists of a self-assessment questionnaire provided to the third party. They then fill those out ideally and return them ideally before the contract is signed, which allows the contracting organization to make a sound business decision based on the risks that were found, or provide feedback in what needs to be remediated in terms of what was any issues that were found as part of the assessment process. Some organizations are more forward-thinking and really trying to focus on not just the self-assessment questionnaire, but go into a deeper technical analysis of the respondents' results, the respondents' answers, and then but what they're finding is that oftentimes takes specialized skill sets or takes time away from either systems engineers or application developers in order to make a true assessment of the risk from the information that was provided by the vendor. We also have organizations that are trying to provide some thought leadership in this space, and they're trying to sell solutions that oftentimes are focused on either the speed aspect, meaning when an organization desires to contract with some other organization that desires a relationship, if they have already filled out a questionnaire, they can make that information available broadly to a number of different companies. If the organization that desires a relationship is not in their database or hasn't filled out their version of the questionnaire, then either the organization or the party that's trying to sell the solution will contact the organization that desires the relationship, have them fill out that questionnaire and get them through the process. The idea here is that not only can the third parties answer a set of standardized questions, but can also get some sort of proprietary risk score that's associated with the company that's selling the solution. Alternatively, there's also a set of companies that are working on solutions in which they provide either external scans or internal scans of various capabilities within the organization that desires the relationship, and then they provide those results either exclusively to the company that paid them to provide it, or more broadly, we're using the same model that we talked about in the previous example, where those results can be shared with a number of different organizations. That said, there are a set of complicating factors. As you can see on social media, people have identified that a lot of the information that comes back simply isn't true, or has low fidelity in terms of being able to trust that information. Oftentimes the sale is more important than identifying the risk, and that can happen on both sides of the sale relationship. Additionally, a lot of third-party providers, especially the big cloud providers, have no interest in providing information back to their customers in terms of what beyond some downloadable set of PDFs around what their particular status is. So it makes the cyber risk process significantly more difficult, because essentially we're talking about garbage in, garbage out. We can't trust the fidelity of the information, and so we're making decisions essentially on either a lack of information, or we are not even having vendors play the game in terms of providing the information that's needed for the analysis. So as a result of our conventional thinking, we get some pretty common outcomes from what I can see when talking to other friends of mine that are CISO, and also from social media. The first is that these assessments take time and resources, headcount, brain power, and analytical skill, and also they don't scale. In many cases, each assessment is unique and really needs time for care and feeding in order to get to a place where we can understand the risks. The second issue is we aren't always able to keep up. The purchase decision may outrun the time that it takes to perform a high fidelity assessment. And that could be from pressure from internally within your own organization. There's a perception, this process is too slow, we're going to go ahead and make the decision. Or it could come from outside the organization, particularly from the sales team, that's involved with the vendor that's selling you this whatever product or service that's being assessed. Assessments may involve a wide set of capabilities, each of which requires specific skill sets to understand. And then there may be alignment issues between the skill sets that oftentimes may not be considered through the assessment process. The other piece is, who would have thought that a bad actor would take over a major software program and begin deploying malicious code globally. So these are all issues that sometimes we may minimize the risk because we don't think that it's possible. We associate probability with severity. So the more severe, the less likely it is to occur, which simply isn't true. We also may be just not have the right skill sets or not have access to the right skill sets within the time frame that's required for the assessment. And so these risks we might either identify something that we're not sure about and then minimize that risk in the interest of closing the deal, or we may just completely not identify it as a risk at all. The other part, the last point here probably is more applicable to CISO level or senior cybersecurity practitioners. At the end of the day, we have to be able to measure our output. There's very few things within our program's purview that aren't measured in some way or that we haven't wrapped success metrics around. So just doing risk assessment after risk assessment after risk assessment after risk assessment is, to me, metaphorically somewhat like bailing a boat. You just keep bailing and bailing and bailing and bailing, and you're not necessarily either fixing the boat or ensuring that you're getting to shore. So wrapping a program around this activity includes making things measurable to know that we're being successful with the time and effort that we're putting into it. So here's an unpopular opinion. What if we're focusing completely on the wrong outcomes with our third-party cyber risk assessment program? What if we're not thinking about it the right way? What if we need to turn it on its head so that we get measurable outcomes, so that we can focus on the assessments that make the most sense? What if we can make these assessments actionable instead of just putting them into some format, identifying some set of risks that never get remediated, never come up until there's some sort of incident? What if we could do that? How cool would that be? So I think the first step that we need, if we're going to go down that path, is to change how we think about cyber risk assessments. I like to use the metaphor cattle versus pets. Very healthy metaphor in a lot of different ways. And today we, treat our each of the assessments kind of individually, like puppies. Like, oh, what a good boy, such a good boy, and working through, taking to the vet, walking them, providing them food. And when there's multiple ones, each of those has to get the same level of attention, because of course we love puppies. I love puppies. I love cats. So that becomes a model that we're accustomed to. But what if we started treating these like cattle, where we start to understand that there's herds or groups of assessments, and we have generally standardized set of processes and approaches for dealing with each one, instead of dealing with each one as some individualized boutique, in some individualized boutique manner. I'm a big believer in taxonomy. Taxonomy is where you differentiate, you group things, and you that allows you to then standardize your process around how you deal with a given group. It's part and parcel to the cattle versus pets metaphor. there's a common saying among engineers that if you don't know what it is, it's probably DNS. It's always DNS, but clearly at the CISO level or at the senior cyber practitioner level, oftentimes it's taxonomy that we need to worry about. So what I've developed here is just a set of differentiators, example ones that probably apply to almost any organization, and I've ordered them in my opinions. In my opinion is the order at which the most due diligence is required. So you can see the small scale on the left-hand side of the slide, and by having a set of groups, now we can begin to apply a set of standardized process around each group instead of dealing with each individual third party in a very boutique way. So I prioritize these based on the likely amount of due diligence that's required for each scenario. And I believe that these scenarios apply broadly across any sort of organization. It would be clearly important from a legal perspective to understand and have special rules for organizations that deal with our own sensitive information. So our organization's sensitive information, either within their own organization or within our infrastructure. Because any mishandling or incident involving that data might actually lead to a reportable breach. The next issue is third parties that have some sort of integration or hands-on relationship with us in some way. So either there is a technical integration, or they, as part of their work, they have network access and they use that network access for something other than just email or something. They provide some tangible value in terms of using that access. Alternatively, we may think of that technical integration as SaaS providers, particularly ones that hold some sort of sensitive information for us. And then lastly, we have organizations that, as part of their work, they don't need network access. They may have physical access to our facilities, or they may perform some other work that does not require them to gain credentials or otherwise be able to access our infrastructure. So now what we can do is, this lets us begin to put rules, not monolithically across all of our vendors, but apply a set of rules that can protect us from various risks that might occur. Now, obviously, organizations that are holding sensitive information in their own infrastructure or in a partner infrastructure of some sort probably will require the most due diligence. You may have set up various standards for each of these. In some cases, you may end up deciding that we already have a set of standards for information that's being stored or accessed that within your own infrastructure. You may ultimately decide that you want to use essentially your own standards and policies that you have for your own employees, and then apply those to the third-party organization. So what might some of those outcomes look like when we think through these various taxonomies? First of all, you may end up with a set of standards and policies that you may rewrite specifically for contractors or for third parties, whether that be vendors or individuals. In our organization, we had this employee handbook that was great. One of the first things that we handled after I'd been on staff about a year was really pushing for what I called a contractor handbook, which would essentially outline all of the standards and policies that particularly technical contractors, anyone with access to our network, would have to adhere to. and then they would sign for that, just like employees sign and acknowledge the employee handbook. That's been very successful, that approach. Next, you might have group-specific data collection requirements. Hey, if you're handling our PII, we might want to know, to have direct contact information for your security team, or for your CISO, or for your legal team, depending on what the nature and character is of the relationship that you have. If you have a technical integration, perhaps having something beyond, if the revenue and value of information is significant, you may need to have direct access also to the infrastructure team. So, what's the set of information that each group, once you've defined the groups within your own organization, what's the set of information that you need for each of those groups, so that you can be sure that you have the information that you need at hand, regardless of whether an incident occurs at 2 p.m. or 2 a.m. You may also decide that there's a set of contractual clauses that are applicable to a given group that we want to ensure are in every single contract that for members of that group, and that may vary significantly by group. There may be no contractual clauses at all around incident response or notification for if sensitive information is not involved. However, you may decide, and you in conjunction with your legal team may decide, we probably want to know if our information was placed at risk as early as possible when that third party has reported a breach. And so rather than sitting and waiting for news reports, you can have something that contractually obligates them to inform you within some reasonable amount of time. Remember, the first 12 to 24 hours, they're probably going to be involved still in discovery and just understanding the nature of any incident. So, but these are things that, because you have specific skin in the game with this vendor, you may decide to ensure that you're part of the formal communication loop that they have as a result of any breach or incident that they have on their particular side. And then lastly, we can begin to do interesting things when we have this taxonomy in place. So as a CISO, or like I said, if you're a senior, some other sort of senior practitioner, or if you're an executive, you can begin to develop views of what your threat landscape looks like from a third-party perspective. Here's where we have risk of PII or other sensitive information. Here's where we have risk of technical integrations. Here's where we have risk because we have vendors that are working in our systems. So when a impactful but not industry-wide breach occurs, whether it's 2 p.m. or 2 a.m., you know what your risk surface area is when there is a breach announced by an organization with which you have some sort of risk surface area. And that can be answered very quickly with either a detailed view or very quickly turned into an executive presentation for either your enterprise risk management organization, your executive team, or just within the security team itself as part of incident response. So you're not running around asking questions all the time with every breach around, do we have a technical integration with this company? Do we have employees from this company that are working with sensitive information and might have access to our networks? Do we have, do we need to worry about that breach somehow in that third party somehow making its way to us either in terms of a technical traversal or lateral movement, or more trustworthy phishing emails being sent from that organization to members of our organization, which then opens us up to more risk. So really, it's our touch points, or our integrations, our relationships that form that we need to be more concerned about when risks potentially turn into threats. So we have these risks, we've identified them, they may or may not be high fidelity, but certainly if we understand our risk surface area, we can begin to turn those, the risk surface area are facts. We either have an integration or we don't. We know the nature of that integration because there's two sides of that. We know if it is a tightly coupled integration in which potentially a bad actor could laterally traverse into our system, or some sort of loosely coupled integration. We have an API gateway or something like that with REST, in which it's less likely perhaps to be able to traverse into our network in some way, or laterally move into our network. So by focusing on the touch points, we essentially negate the problem of incomplete or low fidelity information, because we're focusing on the facts that we know as an organization. So by determining that risk surface area, determining what those touch points are, where the organization is in, when there is an announcement of a breach by a third party with which we have a relationship, now we can really focus on executing that playbook for IR breaches. And that's got to be for all groups. So you may be thinking, oh, well, X third party doesn't have any sort of technical integration. They're not in our network. They don't even have authorized credentials. That said, as I mentioned before, if the email has been taken over, it presents opportunities for phishing from legitimate sources that, or from legitimate contacts that people might be more apt to either click on a malicious link or open a malicious document. Now, one of the things that we do in our organization, for instance, as part of our third-party playbook, is we get alerts when we begin to get emails after an incident from a compromised third party, or a third party that's announced that they've been breached. That way we can, at least as a security team, understand if emails are coming and in mass, what they look like, and ensure that our organization stays safe. We also have a third-party managed service provider around phishing, and we can alert them so that they can also just update their vigilance and ensure that we have an appropriate amount of vigilance for any suspected malicious activity that involves communications from a third party that has announced a compromise. So now we're really starting to get into the meat of the video. So from a CISO perspective, it's really important that we understand how we measure success around any activity that we do, particularly an activity that involves the time and resources that third-party cyber risk assessments do. What we wanted, ideally, in my opinion, and what's working for us within my organization, is moving the measurement of success from the number of assessments that we do, or strictly the time frame that they get turned around, to really understanding, are we spending the right amount of time in the right places? Meaning, are we following our taxonomy? So there are certain groups that we know we're going to be spending more time with at the expense of other organizations that have less risk and are accounted for through either contractual clauses, an IR playbook, or standards and policies. So we're moving the measurement of success from the actual activity of third-party assessment to improving our ability to respond when a third party has announced a breach. We already have metrics around that. That's easy to measure. You still have mean time to response, you still have all of your incident response metrics that now apply not just to internal incidents, but you can also extend them to external incidents, with the idea being you're spending less time running around trying to figure out what the risk surface area is. You already have all of that identified as part of the risk assessment program, or as part of the risk assessment process. So we've extended that risk assessment to include contact information, contractual clauses. We've mapped our risk surface area across the broad set of third parties that we have, to really be able to, during an incident, quickly identify what that risk surface area is and respond via playbook appropriately. So the metrics really become part of the incident response program at the end of the day. And we can take the lessons learned as part of those responses, and we feed those back into the third-party risk assessment program. What didn't we ask? What information is key that we need in order to ensure that we can respond more quickly to a given third-party response? Just because you have a playbook doesn't necessarily mean that it's effective until you actually run through it a couple of times. And if you can either simulate a breach by some various groups within your taxonomy, or as third-party breaches develop and are announced, you can run through the process and ensure that we're prepared from a perspective, from a actual outcome perspective. You may identify things like, hey, at some point we turned off MFA for a group of vendors, or we aren't doing X that we thought that we were doing, and when we double checked as a result of the playbook, we found that there were gaps. Perfectly normal, get them fixed, and by this way you're ready to respond if for some reason you do have a breach that impacts you, and you have what you need in place to help your legal team assess if a reportable breach is occurring as a result of this third-party breach. Ultimately, what you want is the third-party vendor risk assessment program to become a integral and operationalized part of your overall infosec program. You have measurements, you're able to determine if you're being successful, you're spending time in something that, if a risk turns to a threat, will ultimately save you a large amount of time and investment in your response area. You'll also have an ability to now report on success metrics, either to the board, to the C-level folks, to your enterprise risk function, in order to show that the investment that we're making in a particular in this risk assessment program now is more efficient. We're spending more time on the things that we need to be spending time on, and less time than what we need to be spending time on, because there's actually less risk, and that risk is more likely to be mitigated by some of the other remediations that we've put in place, such as contractual clauses, standards and policies, or playbooks. So thank you for your time. That's all for today. I hope you continue to prioritize security over compliance, and really think through how you can provide value through your third-party cyber risk assessment program. Subscribe.